Hi all, a very dramatic game today, game 6. Magnus Carlsen had been in the lead from game 5, so was today just going to be trying to consolidate his lead or trying for a win? Was Vishy just going to try for a win here to equalise the match? So let's see what happens. E4 from Vishy Anand, E5 from Magnus, sticking to his classical repertoire. That's the most frequent move I believe he plays, to E4. Just very classical. Knight F3, now Knight C6. We have Bishop B5, the Spanish game, or Roy Lopez, as it is known. So Knight F6 now. This is the Berlin defense. We see now Vishy Anand playing the move D3. A little bit of a surprise. The most common move is actually castling on my live book, or Knight C3 is another idea. But we see D3. Is this a bit on the passive side? Now usually, believe it or not actually, you might think it's nice to get the bishop out. It looks nice to get the bishop out. But of equal usage is actually D6, just keeping the bishop at home. But we see Magnus venturing the bishop out to C5. It might run into a C3 and D4. There's some downsides, of course, to factor in when playing bishop C5. At the moment, there's no pawn that can be taken or anything. If takes here, we can just let's just check this 100% sure, so I don't say anything too silly. But this one, we just play Queen D4 here, and we're just hitting these two, and then Black's winning easily a piece. So we can't take on C6. So we see now C3, well, not at least to win the pawn on E5. So C3 was played. Now both sides castle, Rook E8, Rook E1, A6. So these are fairly standard opening moves so far. Bishop A4, B5, the bishop goes to B3, D6, and now there's not too many games from this position. And in fact, this is quite a rare move now. Bishop G5. Usual is Knight BD2, but Vishy Anand played Bishop G5 here. And this is a move which reminds me of a game against Michael Adams earlier in the year, Bishop E6, or was it last year, where Magnus managed to play British #1 Grandmaster Michael Adams, accepting double pawns. It's interesting, Bishop E6 might not actually be the top engine move from an engine point of view. Just H6, which is less dynamic than potential for double pawns, which Magnus played. Bishop takes E6 does weaken a little bit Black's control of the light squares though, so there's some upsides to it. On Rook takes E6, this would be bad because of D4. We're potentially playing D5, forking two pieces. It seems after ED, CD, it might not be entirely clear. There's a Bishop B4. So if D5 here, we've got, we can take on E1, and that's interesting. If taking here, then Bishop takes F2, and it's chaos. I think if anyone's going to be better, it's Black. So this is an interesting complication, Bishop B4. This is a hairy line, but White can just play Rook E2 here and still suspend this D5. Knight E7. White's just actually a little bit better here, so it's not actually winning a piece because of that Bishop B4 resource. So let's go back though. Bishop takes E6. Let's imagine F takes E. From an engine point of view, this could be slightly favourable for White. Weakening the light squares. There's A4 in this position, and with a potential follow-up of Knight A3 to try and get onto that C4 square. So if Bishop B6, for example, Knight A3, B4, Knight C4, this might be quite pleasant for White. D5 is restricted because we've got this pressure, laying pressure on E5 here. So there might have been a justification, technically, in this exact position to take on E6 in conjunction with this idea of A4 and Knight A3. If getting a knight to C4. So, but instead we see the knight simply going to D2 here, which seems like a fairly solid safe move. h6, the bishop drops back. It's not too concerned. Vishy Anand's not too concerned about g5 here. That would be probably quite terrible for black with that gaping f5 now a massive weakness. If we can sort of wriggle the knight to f5, this is not the sort of thing which might be that pleasant. Even though there's been a classic game of Capablanca playing black where he kind of imprisoned the bishop on g3, so it's not completely absurd to think about such possibilities in this position. In fact, it is actually an engine suggestion here. One of the top engine moves is to play g5. It's not completely crazy. But Magnus took on b3 here. Now, let's see if knight takes just bishop a7. I think that's about equal, that position. But Vishy took more dynamically with a takes b3, so he's potentially fixing this weakness. Well, weakness in inverted commas on a6, this backward pawn on that semi-open file. The problem here is that black can try, if that is fixed, to later play a5 if it's supported by bishop b6. For the moment, Magnus retreats now his knight, and this is a typical plan, pardon me, in the Braille systems, to retreat the knight to re-centralize it. So it's quite a cute little maneuver, which Magnus has used quite a bit in his games as black. We see now h3. Knight bd7, and now one of the facilities that h2 to h3 did offer was that h2 square, and we see quite a cute little knight move, knight h2, with the idea, it seems, that knight g4 and maybe even queen f3 to exert pressure on this knight on f6. This bishop being over here cannot easily add support for the f6 knight, but is this such a big deal? We see Magnus simply playing queen e7 now. And now let's see, if knight g4, it's not such a big deal. Black could just probably do what he did in the game, which was queen e6. What was actually played was knight df1, which offers the possibility of maneuvering the knight to one of these two squares in the future. Bishop b6 ahead of that potential threat b4. Knight e3 now, and it looks as though knight f5 to gain a tempo on the queen, but ahead of that threat is queen e6 is played. That gives black more options. It also ties down the queen to b3 for the moment. That pawn is now moved, so that fixes the pawn on a6, and maybe white can try and play on both sides of the board here, but black doesn't want to keep that backward pawn, as evidenced by this next move, a5. Magnus is swapping off and undoubling the pawns here, but he's trading his structural concern for white's structural concern here by playing a5. So getting rid of his backward pawn, bishop takes a5. And I assumed when looking at the game live earlier today, and that was great fun by the way, that b4 might be of significance, but maybe it's not. Maybe just knight c4. The knight immediately goes to c4, hitting a5. So I'm not entirely sure b4's a big deal. You can imagine if c4, then we've got the c5 square quite comfortably. This is not a big deal. Knight hg4 is played here, just putting a bit more pressure on f6. So let's just see that. If b4, then we just play, surely we just come to use the c4 square. Well, there might be even better. So let's have a look. Knight takes, bishop takes f6, queen takes. In fact, it's no big deal at all. Knight d5 here hits the queen. Where can we put the queen here? And then c takes b4 is actually winning a pawn. So this is not actually brilliant for black at all, this position. So in the game we see bishop b6 now, with the option potentially to take on e3 at the right moment. Bishop takes f6, knight takes, and Magnus takes off another two pieces. Knight takes, queen takes. So quite simplified already, and even more simplified now. Queen g4, because Vishy just takes on e3, so all the minor pieces have just gone in the space of a few moves now. So f takes e3, and I just assumed, oh dear, I've come on the wrong day, it's going to be a draw soon. So my first experiment with a bit of live commentary for these games, I thought it was going to be a disappointing draw from this position. It looks as though they just want, both players wanted a draw today. We see Queen e7, Rook f1. I mean, neither side wants to take, because you'd end up giving their opponent the A file here. So the rook's in a state of tension, just staring at each other, like gunslingers in a spaghetti western. They're just staring at each other there. So c5 is played, which kind of locks down a bit the mobility of the pawn structure here, to try and discourage d4. So you wouldn't imagine White needs to play at all for d4 at any point in the future. It's interesting that okay, what can White do? He just plays king h2, but there is actually a positional threat. If we just rewind that, there's actually a positional threat with c5, which is to undermine the structure here, to play c4, and also to fix these two pawns, because it would restrain this pawn if a pawn's on c4. So there is a potential positional threat in this position. It also opens up this diagonal for queen b7. So it's a very clever move, c5. So after king h2, in fact, the positional threat is executed. We see c4. And White is holding on to a pawn tactically now, having to hold on tactically after d4. So you might think, before we go on from that committal moment, couldn't White have done something about this move c4? Engines are suggesting maybe queen e2, because then that tries to discourage c4. If c4 here, we could just take that, that's fine, and then take with the queen after. So if Black tries to increase the pressure with queen b7, is there a way of actually defending this positional threat? Well, it seems that queen c2, Black can now play c4 anyway. And this is quite pleasant for Black, but this looks like a good way to keep it relatively compact, the position. Let's just give a token move. If we ever take here, then it's not like both sides have got structural weaknesses, so maybe this isn't so brilliant, but Black's got a little bit of play with rook a4. But anyway, this positional threat was allowed for Black, permitted to play the move c4 here, and it is undermining White's structure. White doesn't want to take on c4 because we end up with a backward pawn, as well as exposure on the e pawn on this diagonal. If we took here, this is surely quite positionally bad after b takes. So backward pawn, just one sole pawn is restraining two pawns by itself. So Vishy plays what is a little bit surprising d4, because it looks as though on the surface that e takes d4, e4 is vulnerable. We now see rook takes a1 is played here. Rook takes a1. And tactically, we must ask what is going on here with this e4 pawn. If e takes d4, pardon me, rook takes a1, queen takes a1. If e takes d4 here, e takes d4, Black can win this pawn, but it might not be a big deal. The check and rook b8 doesn't look like a big deal here. White's going to be getting the pawn back, so it'll be equal on pawns, and it should be a draw here. But against Magnus, anything's possible, even in what seems to be a completely drawn position, as we know from past experience of his games this year. So let's go back. So in the game, after recapturing on a1, queen b7 was played. So that avoids the possibility of any check here. So black is threatening simply to take and win the e4 pawn. And perhaps one way of handling this would be d5. And I'm not sure, and I'm not really entirely sure how white's position could be compromised here further. Ideally, you'd think you'd try and undermine this pawn chain with f5, but it's always going to weaken black's king safety to ever try and play for f5. And white has this, pressure on the f file anyway, glaring down the f file. So it'll be difficult to see how this can be increased for black. In fact, engines give this position as dead equal, just playing this move d5 here. If I just demonstrate that, say rook f8, if we take this a bit further, just follow this engine line here, say even taking on c3, which looks a little bit dangerous. It's queen f5. If queen b3 ever, rook a7, rook f8, rook d7, so there's always ways of counter-attacking anyway. So it didn't seem such a bad deal to play d5, but in the game we see mysteriously a little bit the move rook d1 instead, and that's a bit of a shocker. When I saw this, I thought, why allow this possibility of ed? Ed wasn't even played though. Another surprising move. Ed would seem to be quite nice here, because if rook takes d4, okay, rook e6, this structure doesn't look too healthy here. Rook d5, queen b6, queen b6, whoops, and I don't know how black actually makes progress in this position again. Okay, so but black does seem to be better structurally. Queen c6 instead was played, encouraging white for d5. It's like making a statement that d5 is somehow positionally wrong, but at least from an engine point of view it doesn't seem as though it's a big deal. Instead we see queen f5, allowing again these seemingly horrible double pawns, and now Magnus does inflict them on white with e takes d4. So if white doesn't want to lose a pawn, he has to take with a rook now to support the e4 pawn. And we see now rook e5 kicking the queen, it goes to f3, queen c7, and now we have some mysterious waiting maneuvers. I was wondering if just one of them is going to offer a draw at any time. Queen g4, king h7, queen f4, we see g6, king h2, king g7. I seriously thought nothing much is going on here. So this is around move 37 now, queen f3, rook e6. Nothing much seems to be going on here. Until this shocker, rook, queen g3. I didn't understand at all why queen g3 had been played, giving up e4. Before we look at queen g3, so move 38, queen g3, did white have to give up the pawn? Is white somehow mysteriously being outplayed here? If king g1, then there is the possibility, I guess, of making some progress with the pieces. Rook f6, queen e5 looks aggressive, rook e6, but white is equal on pawns, at least. I know he's living with this horrendous double pawns, but is it such a big deal, this sort of position? I wouldn't have thought so, but okay, so we get this mysterious queen g3 on move 38, which does give up the e4 pawn. And although white's taking on d6, he's losing e3 after this. The other alternative is to take on e4 first. That might actually be worse, to take on e4 first here. Queen takes d6. queen takes e3, black is comfortable here. He can carry on with ideas like this. Say queen d5, check. I mean, black's comfortable here, so, and also this b2 pawn is a bit of a worry. But you know, white's always got a perpetual check possibility, so maybe that's interesting as well. But the way Vishy took was actually to play queen takes d6. So now we see rook takes e3. Another possibility there was just taking the queen and then rook takes e3. But Magnus, I mean, these two possibilities are about the same, just taking on e3. So rook takes e3. Vishy now takes on e7. Rook takes it, now goes for the b5 pawn. So move 41. That's now protected with rook b7. And now, you know, most people would have thought this would be a draw. So at move 42 we see rook d6. Now f6, which does give black a potential way of making progress. I'm not saying a win or anything, but it supports the e5 square, so that later rook e7 to e5 can start to make progress like that. Maybe the king coming up later, you know, with g5 and king g6. So the point is to hold that e5 square for a rook later to support b5 if needed. We see a strange plan now of h4 being played, which looks in one way quite clever to fragment the pawns, but is this a little bit dubious? King f7, and now so this pawn sacrifice is now played. White played h5, which is a bit mysterious. If he played king g3, is it entirely clear that black can make progress? Let's imagine rook e7, king f3, and rook e5, like was mentioned before. G5, g4, h5. Let's go with this. This kind of scenario, at least from an engine point of view, it's not such a big deal. I mean, maybe can white sit this out? Just holding b5 here stops the rook coming to e2 to harass b2 here. So maybe this is the way to try and secure the draw, not do anything too clever. But we got in the game this idea of h5, which does have a downside. It has an upside, it's wrecking the structure, but it is another pawn to go down, g takes, and this double pawn isn't so completely useless, because potentially, you know, h4, h3 undermines this for this one to be more important. So this extra pawn is quite interesting. If white, you know, maintains that pawn on h4, it's harder to imagine such possibilities. So let's see, h5, the pawn is taken actually. Now g5 might not be so good. Let's just quickly check this out. I think king g3, it's difficult for black to make progress here. So I think Magnus did the right thing with g takes h5, rook d5, attacking the pawn on h5, king g6, king g3, rook b6. So the f pawn is ready to step forward potentially without any rook d6. Rook c5, now f5, the f pawn steps forward. So this is the prime candidate, and this is a sacrificial pawn here which can be used to help if needed. The f pawn, king h4. Now a very dramatic kind of positional pawn sacrifice for Magnus, which he's becoming very famous for now in this World Championship match. He just gives up the b5 pawn with rook e6. One feature of this structure, white should really take on b5, is that this pawn is holding both these pawns because of that restraint en passant potentially. This pawn's quite a restraining pawn for these two. And now black's rook can become more active check, king h3, king g5, and we're getting to this scenario where this mechanism is becoming a more realistic possibility of undermining g2 for this f pawn to go through. Rook b8, h4, check, king h8, rook f8, holding the f pawn for a moment, rook f4, rook c8. Engines give this as equal though at move 54, rook g4, rook f8. Magnus plays check, king h2. Now king g5, check, king f4, and in this position at move 58 it seems this is already quite troublesome because of this king invasion. Should it have been stopped? But engines suggest in theory at least, rook c8 could hold the position. But king e3, it looks in practice quite tricky here indeed. Very, very tricky indeed. This king activity is a total menace. Now this is where Magnus Carlsen is better than engines in endgames, because I don't know any human players who could survive this if they had to play with pinpoint accuracy. I think an easier way of playing the position was to stop this king infiltration. Let's just rewind here. Was there an easier way to hold this king getting in? I mean, here I think Vishy pointed out himself rook c8 in this position. So because this check is dissuading surely the king from coming to f4. This would be a big blunder here to play king f4 here surely. Pardon me. So if we go to this position, okay, check here, check here, rook c8, rook g4, rook f8, check, king h2, king g5. So the idea of rook c8 to dissuade king f4. So if king f4, white can play rook takes c4 check, and he's on h4. That's a key point, and this should be okay for white, absolutely okay. If that h pawn's knocked out, we're still holding against this dreaded f pawn, and this is okay. So that maybe is a much easier position to play with rook c8 here, because otherwise this king is getting very aggressive. If there's any draw that exists, it will require, you know, pinpoint machine accuracy, I think. But I don't know how black makes progress here. If rook g4, then check. If king f4 here, we seem to be getting to a similar scenario in the game. So let's just leave that rook on c8. Is there any other move we can play here to safely draw this? It looks pretty dangerous actually. Rook g8 check. I mean, it looks as though I mean, king f4, rook e8. We're in a dangerous territory nearly. Okay, the king can be cut off from e3. So in the game, what we witnessed though was something quite different. The king, after rook g8 check, king f4, can white just cut off the king here with rook e8? If king e3 is such a concern. If rook e8, there is already h3 here. This is dangerous. So this is very tricky stuff. The pinpoint accuracy method, rook c8, that was played at move 58, and we see king e3, and it's like Magnus has set this as a trap. but Engine seems to think, in theory, there's a line somewhere where white is able to hold this. I think this just might be one of those cases that's above Engine horizon, even at depth 23. If rook takes c4 was played, f4, and Magnus just thought, you know, this f pawn is quicker than these two. He's just going to play h3 to undermine this and get his f pawn going. There's only one move which in theory seems to hold, b4. Let's just look at a theoretical move at move 60, b4, h3 takes rook g7 or rook g6. In theory, rook c7. Then if f3 check, king f2, b5, check, king g3, and it gets dangerous for the h3 pawn, check, and there's a point here that king takes h3 is too slow, because there was a pretty idea that rook takes here, which I saw in the live thing, but it was with the pawn just one step before, and otherwise this would be mating, but here it's not in time. White's queening. It's just one tempo difference that white's queening, and it's with check as well. But it's important to get that b pawn going to avoid these possibilities, and so maybe that's what needs to be played. b4 here at move 60 might in theory secure the draw because of that idea that h3 is coming up. It's impossible for human brains to consider this, but at move 60 b4 is like technically a way of drawing this in theory. So even with this king coming to e3, which is what Magnus thought might have been, he did stress might have been winning. If b4 is the only move, that's a fine line to tread. We see rook a4 instead. Now we get this fast idea of h3 being played out. So the f pawn is now very, very quick. G takes, but it can't be moved immediately because of king takes g3. So rook g6, so the f pawn's ready to roll. c4 f3. It's pretty dangerous now, the f pawn. Simply threatening f2 and queening. So we see check, king e2, b4. I think these pawns are just too slow. f2, check, king f3, check, king f4, rook a8, setting a last trap. That rook f8 check will win the queen. Magnus just plays rook g1. He's building that, docking his pawn now. It's going to be supported by the rook, and Vishy resigned here. If he plays check, then just king e3, and we're queening soon. These pawns are not quick enough, not far enough to compensate for queening. So check, check, king d3, check. Well, we can even take here. We're just queening basically anyway, so you get the idea. It's hopeless, this position. After the checks run out, we just win the rook. So what a shocker, and one which I totally didn't expect from today. I thought at first I picked the exact wrong game to do live commentary on, getting this drawn rook and pawn ending, drawish looking, which would be agreed a draw much earlier on than this. I didn't expect any decisive result, so it was very, very interesting for the spectators. It looks as though Magnus has got a healthy lead now in the match, +2. So I expect Vishy's going to put up a good fight on Monday to try and get a point back. So that'll be very interesting. I'll be doing some live commentary hopefully on Monday, possibly with Paul Georgiou. If you want to join me on just on YouTube, not on anywhere else, just on YouTube. There'll be a video which I've created as an event, so I hope you can join us on Monday. It will be hopefully a very interesting dual commentary with myself and Paul for the next game. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.